October 14th, 1934, 6:18 a.m. The air over the Hudson River was thick with the smell of salt, diesel, and decaying fish. But for a longshoreman named Patrick McHale, working Pier 12 on Manhattan's west side, a new scent cut through the morning fog. It was acrid, sickly sweet, the smell of something gone terribly wrong. He followed it to a stack of cargo waiting to be loaded onto a freighter bound for Havana. There, nestled between crates of machine parts and textiles, was a single, solitary, 55-gallon steel drum. It was new, but already showing rust spots from the damp air. The smell was coming from the barrel. McHale called his foreman. The foreman called the police. Two patrolmen from the 10th Precinct arrived at 6:47 a.m. They pried the lid off. The stench hit them like a physical blow, a wall of putrefaction that made their eyes water and their stomachs churn. Inside, packed in a gruesome slurry of lye and decomposing flesh, were the pieces of a man. He had been expertly dismembered. The police report would later note the cuts were precise, almost surgical. His expensive suit was shredded, and a diamond pinky ring was still on a severed finger. The man was identified by his dental records later that day. His name was Salvatore Moretti, a low-level bookie and enforcer from East Harlem with a reputation for two things: a lucky streak at cards and a mouth that never, ever stopped running. He had been missing for 3 days. What nobody knew, what the history books and the official police reports will never tell you, is that Salvatore Moretti's fate was sealed 72 hours earlier, in the smoke-filled back room of a social club on 116th Street, over a hand of 5-card stud and a debt of $400. A debt owed not to Moretti, but by him. A debt of respect. The man he had disrespected was Vito Genovese, and in Vito Genovese's world, some debts could only be paid in blood. To understand what happened in that room, you have to understand the world it existed in. The year was 1934. The Great Depression had its teeth sunk deep into the marrow of America. But in the shadows of New York City, a different kind of economy was roaring back to life. Prohibition was dead. The 13-year-long noble experiment had ended in December 1933, and the rivers of illegal booze that had made men like Charles Lucky Luciano and his contemporaries into kings were drying up. This was a period of immense change and brutal consolidation in the American underworld. The old guard, the mustache Petes, who saw themselves as Sicilian warlords transplanted to a new world, were gone. They had been swept away in the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict that ended with Luciano creating the Commission, a corporate-style board of directors for organized crime. It was designed to prevent wars, regulate territories, and maximize profits. It was a new era, built on cold, hard business principles rather than old-world vendettas. Vito Genovese was the perfect man for this new era. Born in Riciliano, a frazione of the commune of Tufino, in the province of Naples, Italy, he was not Sicilian. He was Neapolitan. This was a crucial distinction. While the Sicilians were often stereotyped as insular and bound by ancient traditions, the Neapolitans were seen as more adaptable, more cunning, more urban. Genovese embodied this. He was 5 feet 7 inches, with a square jaw and a gaze that seemed to penetrate right through you. He wasn't physically imposing, like some of his brutish contemporaries. His power was in his mind. By 1934, he was Luciano's underboss, his fist. But more importantly, his brain. Where Luciano was the visionary, the chairman of the board, Genovese was the COO. He handled operations. He enforced the new rules. He was a man who understood that true power wasn't about being the loudest man in the room, but the one everyone was afraid to whisper about. He ruled through a carefully cultivated aura of absolute authority. Respect was his currency, and he hoarded it jealously. An insult, a slight, a challenge to his authority, these were not personal affronts. They were cracks in the foundation of the entire structure he helped build. And Vito Genovese did not tolerate cracks. His territory was Greenwich Village, but his influence stretched across the city. He had his hands in the unions, in loan sharking, in the burgeoning narcotics trade. But his real business was order. He provided a brutal, but predictable, form of justice in a world where the official channels were either corrupt or non-existent. He was, in a strange and twisted way, a community protector. He kept the freelance thugs and petty criminals in line. He made sure the store owners paid their insurance, and in return, he guaranteed no one else would bother them. It was a system built on a razor's edge of fear and loyalty. And everyone in that system, from the highest-ranking capo down to the lowest numbers runner, understood the fundamental rule. You do not cross Vito Genovese. Not for money, not for pride, not for anything. Because the consequences were not just severe, they were educational. Vito didn't just eliminate problems. He turned them into lessons for everyone else. This was the world Salvatore Sal the Mouth Moretti walked into on the night of October 11th, 1934. And he was about to break the only rule that mattered. The game was held in the back of the 116th Street Social Club. It was an unofficial headquarters for Genovese's crew, a place where business was discussed over espresso and sambuca. The air was thick with the smoke of expensive cigars. The men at the table were a collection of capos and trusted soldiers, men who understood the delicate dance of power and respect that governed their lives. The game was 5-card stud, $100 buy-in. The stakes were not high enough to break anyone at the table, but they were high enough to make it interesting. The money was secondary. The game was a ritual. It was about reading the men around you, about showing nerve, about knowing when to fold and when to press. Sal Moretti was not a made man. He was an earner, a bookie who ran a profitable little operation under the protection of one of Genovese's capos. He was good at his job, but he had a fatal flaw. He believed his own hype. He was flashy, dressed in suits that were a little too loud, with a diamond pinky ring that was a little too big. He laughed too loudly and talked too much, earning him the nickname, the Mouth. That night, he was on a run. The cards were falling his way. He won a pot with a pair of jacks, then another with 3 kings. With each winning hand, his confidence swelled, and his mouth got louder. He started narrating the game, mocking the other players for folding. "What's the matter, Frankie? Nerves getting to you?" he'd say with a wide, obnoxious grin. The other men at the table, hardened killers and seasoned racketeers, grew quiet. Their eyes flickered towards Vito. Genovese sat at the head of the table, nursing a small glass of anisette. He was quiet, observing. He played his hands methodically, winning a little, losing a little. He seemed unbothered by Moretti's antics. This, in itself, was a warning. Vito's silence was always louder than another man's shouting. The inciting incident began around 1:30 a.m. The pot had grown to just over $400. It was down to two players, Genovese and Moretti. Vito had an ace showing. Moretti had a king. The betting was deliberate. Vito would slide a stack of chips forward. Moretti, with a theatrical flourish, would see his bet and raise it. The other men at the table were statues. The only sounds were the clinking of chips and the soft whisper of the cards. On the final card, Vito was showing a pair of aces, a very strong hand. Moretti was showing a pair of kings. Vito looked at his hole card. His expression was unreadable. He pushed his remaining chips into the center of the table. "All in," he said, his voice a low gravel. The room was a vacuum. This was the moment for Sal Moretti to show he understood the world he was in. The correct play was to fold, to concede the pot to the boss. It wasn't about the money. It was a sign of respect. It was acknowledging the hierarchy. To push the issue would be to imply that this was a game between equals. And they were not equals. Sal Moretti looked at Vito's aces. He looked at his own kings. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face. He believed Vito was bluffing. He saw this as his moment to not just win, but to dominate, to show everyone in that room that he had the nerve to stare down the great Vito Genovese. This was his fatal miscalculation. He saw a card game. He didn't see the test. "I see your bet," Moretti said, his voice booming in the silent room. "And I raise you." He paused for dramatic effect, pulling a wad of cash from his pocket. Another 100. It was a breach of protocol, a slap in the face. Vito's eyes didn't change. He simply nodded to one of his men, who placed another $100 in the pot to cover the raise. "Show them," Vito said. With a grand gesture, Moretti flipped over his hole card. It was another king. He had three of a kind, a monster hand. He started laughing, scooping the massive pile of chips and cash towards him. "Tough luck, Don Vito," he crowed. "Kings beat aces tonight." He had won, but in that moment, he had lost everything. Genovese didn't flip his cards. He simply looked at Sal Moretti. He wasn't angry. He wasn't embarrassed. He looked disappointed, as if a favored student had failed a simple test. Then, a faint cold smile touched his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "Enjoy it," Vito said softly. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked out of the room without another word. The celebration died in Sal Moretti's throat. The remaining men at the table avoided his gaze. They slowly cashed in their chips and filed out, leaving Moretti alone with his winnings and a suddenly very cold room. He had won $400, and he had just signed his own death warrant. Vito Genovese did not go home. He went to a small private office he kept above a bakery in Little Italy. He sat behind a large oak desk and stared out the window at the sleeping city. His mind was not on the $400. The money was an insult, a trifle. He was thinking about the disease of disrespect. He had seen it before. A small challenge goes unanswered. Then another, slightly bolder one, follows. Soon, others see the weakness. They start to test the boundaries. The entire structure, built on fear and absolute authority, begins to crumble. Sal Moretti was not a threat in himself. He was a symptom, a virus that, if left unchecked, could infect the entire organization. The obvious solution was simple. A car would follow Moretti home. A gunman would step out of the shadows. 2 shots to the back of the head. Quick, efficient, problem solved. But Vito rejected this immediately. It was too brutish, too simple. It lacked finesse. A simple murder would be seen as an act of anger, of a man who lost his temper over a card game. It would make him look petty, weak. It would solve the problem of Sal Moretti, but it would not cure the disease of disrespect. No, this required something more. It required a lesson, a piece of theater. The response had to be so disproportionate to the offense that no one would ever dare to even think of repeating it. The message had to be burned into the collective memory of the underworld. He knew, with absolute certainty, that Moretti was already a dead man. The only question was how to make his death meaningful. His thought process was cold and methodical, like a grandmaster contemplating a chessboard. Moretti's weakness was his arrogance, his greed. That would be the hook. The man's own character would be the instrument of his demise. At 3:15 a.m., he made a phone call. 10 minutes later, Tommy, the gun, Galliano, walked into the office. Galliano was a Genovese loyalist, a quiet, competent man with a background in military logistics from the Great War. He wasn't a thinker. He was an implementer. He was the loyal enforcer who translated Vito's strategic vision into brutal reality. Vito didn't raise his voice. He laid out the situation with forensic precision. The card game, the disrespect, the need for a permanent solution. He can't just disappear, Vito stated, looking at Gagliano. People need to know why he disappeared. They need to understand it. They need to fear it. Gagliano just nodded. What do you need, Vito? This is where the plan began to take shape. It wasn't just about killing Moretti. It was about turning him into a ghost story. The first step was information. Vito already had eyes everywhere, but he needed specifics. He dispatched Galliano to have a quiet word with a few people. The bartender from the social club was key. His name was Leo, a man who saw everything and said nothing, a perfect, invisible informant. Leo reported back within the hour. After Vito had left, Moretti had stayed for another drink. He was bragging, not just about winning, but about how he had faced down Genovese. He's getting old, Moretti had slurred to another patron, losing his nerve. His time is passing. This was the final piece Vito needed. It confirmed his diagnosis. Moretti believed he had exposed a weakness. He thought he was on his way up. The plan was brilliant in its psychological cruelty. They wouldn't come for Moretti in the dark. They would invite him into the light. Vito instructed Gagliano to approach a man named Benny, the Weasel, Gallo, a low-level hustler known for setting up deals. Benny owed Galliano a significant favor. Galliano told Benny to approach Sal Moretti with an offer. The offer was this: a major player from out of town, a man from the Detroit partnership, was in New York. He was looking to set up a new, large-scale narcotics pipeline, independent of the commission. He needed a local partner, someone with guts, someone who wasn't afraid of the old guard. He had heard about a man named Sal Moretti, a man who had the stones to stare down Vito Genovese himself and win. It was the perfect bait, tailored to Moretti's ego. It played directly into his fantasy of being a rising star, the promise of immense wealth, and more importantly, the status he craved. The meeting was set for the following night, October 12th, at a supposedly neutral location, a warehouse down by the docks on the west side. A place where no one would be listening. Moretti was told to come alone. The man from Detroit valued discretion. Moretti took the bait. He didn't just take it, he swallowed it whole. The idea that his act of defiance at the card table had been noticed, that it had elevated his status in the eyes of other powerful men, was intoxicating. He spent the entire day preparing, buying a new, even flashier suit. He told his wife he was going to the biggest meeting of his life. The final pieces of the plan were logistical. Galliano secured the warehouse. It was owned by a shipping company secretly controlled by Genovese. He procured a new 55-gallon steel drum. He arranged for a truck. He acquired several bags of quicklime. Each element was chosen for its symbolic weight. The warehouse on the docks, a place of transit where things and people disappeared. The barrel, an anonymous industrial coffin. The lime, a tool to erase a man from existence. Vito's genius was in the details. He understood that the story of what happened would be told and retold for years. Every detail had to reinforce the central message. This wasn't a hot-headed revenge killing. This was a cold, calculated execution, a corporate decision. The night of October 12th arrived. Moretti, dressed to the nines, drove his 1934 Buick sedan to the designated warehouse. He felt like a king. He was sure he was walking toward his future. He was walking into a lesson. If this story is giving you a glimpse into a world you've never seen, do me a favor and hit that like button real quick. It tells the algorithm that you want more of this hidden history. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? You don't want to miss what comes next. The warehouse was cavernous and dark, smelling of rust and river water. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, illuminating a small circle of the concrete floor. Sal Moretti stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He saw a few men standing in the shadows. He recognized Tommy Galliano. This gave him a moment's pause, but then he rationalized it. Of course, Genovese's top man would be here to broker the deal. "Where's the guy from Detroit?" Moretti asked, his voice trying for a confidence it didn't quite have. A figure stepped out from behind a stack of crates and into the light. It was Vito Genovese. The arrogant smile on Sal Moretti's face vanished. It was replaced by a sudden, dawning horror. The blood drained from his face. He looked around, his eyes wide with panic. The other men in the shadows began to step forward. There was no man from Detroit. There was no deal. There was only this room. This was the reveal. The moment of absolute shock and realization. Moretti opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to explain. But no words came out. He finally understood. He hadn't won a card game. He had lost his life. Vito walked slowly towards him. He was not carrying a weapon. His hands were in his pockets. His expression was calm, almost paternal. "Sal," Vito said, his voice quiet but carrying in the silence. "You have a problem with respect." It wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis, a final judgment. Moretti started to babble. "Vito, I'm sorry. It was the game, the whiskey. I meant nothing by it. The money, you can have the money back, all of it." Vito held up a hand, and Moretti fell silent. "It was never about the money," Vito said. "The $400? It means nothing. You could have won 4,000. It would have meant nothing." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The problem," Vito continued, "is that you thought it was a game between you and me. You thought you could win. You thought you could sit at my table, drink my whiskey, and show me, my men, that you were my equal." He took another step closer. Moretti stumbled backward. "There are rules," Vito said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This world, our world, it only works because of the rules. And the first rule is respect. It is the foundation. And you took a sledgehammer to it. For what? For a pot of cards? For a moment of pride? What happened next was not frenzied or chaotic. It was procedural, forensic. Galliano and two other men seized Moretti. They did not beat him. They simply held him. This was not about inflicting pain. It was about erasure. They stripped him of his new suit, the symbol of his misplaced ambition. They took the diamond ring from his finger. Galliano would later drop it into a collection plate at St. Patrick's Cathedral. A final, ironic act. The dismemberment was carried out by a man who had been a butcher in the old country. It was done quickly, efficiently, on a large canvas tarp to keep the floor clean. The focus was on joints, on separating the body into manageable pieces. It was dehumanizing. It reduced Sal Moretti from a man to a task. Vito watched the entire process without flinching. His presence was the most important part of the ritual. This was not some back alley hit ordered from afar. This was a sentence handed down and overseen by the judge himself. When it was done, the pieces were placed in the steel drum. The bags of lye were poured in. Then Galliano and his men mixed and poured concrete on top, sealing the barrel. A 55-gallon headstone. The entire operation took less than 30 minutes. It was a masterclass in brutal efficiency. They left the barrel at Pier 12, a place of departures, a final, symbolic gesture. Sal Moretti was cargo now. He was being shipped out. When the police found the barrel 2 days later, the story was already spreading through the underworld. It didn't travel as a rumor. It traveled as a bulletin, as a policy statement. The details were precise. The card game, the boasting, the fake meeting, the warehouse, the barrel, the lesson. The narrative was controlled by Vito from the start. His men made sure the correct version of the story was the only version that was told. In a barbershop in the Bronx, a capo for the Lucchese family heard the story and went pale. He had been considering making a move on a Genovese-controlled gambling spot. He immediately abandoned the plan. In a restaurant in Brooklyn, soldiers for the Profaci family discussed it in hushed tones. The consensus was universal. Genovese was not to be tested. He was playing a different game than everyone else. The story served its purpose perfectly. It didn't make people think Vito was a hothead. It made them think he was a banker, a ruthless, calculating CEO who would liquidate any asset that threatened the stability of the corporation. The sheer, cold-blooded overkill of the response was the point. It was a statement of power so absolute that it transcended mere violence. It was strategic. A week later, Vito held a meeting with his top capos. The Moretti incident was not on the agenda, but it hung in the air, unspoken. The level of deference he was shown had never been higher. The loyalty in the room was absolute, forged in a new layer of fear and respect. Towards the end of the meeting, Vito finally addressed it indirectly. He looked around the table at his most trusted men. "There is a cost to everything," he said, his voice calm and didactic. "We are in the business of order, and order has a price. Sometimes the price is high, but it must always be paid. You do not defer payments. You do not allow credit. When a debt of respect is due, you collect, immediately, and with interest." He paused, making eye contact with each man, so that no one ever considers defaulting again. The message was received. It became doctrine. The legend of Sal Moretti and the $400 card game became a cautionary tale told to every new associate and soldier who came into the fold for the next 30 years. It was a founding myth of the Genovese crime family, a story that explained the source of its power. The long-term impact was immeasurable. That single brutal act drew a line in the sand. On one side were the common street thugs who killed for money or out of anger. On the other side was Vito Genovese, a man who killed for principle. It solidified his status as an untouchable. It made him a grandmaster in a world of checkers players. He had taken a minor act of disrespect and used it to recalibrate the entire power structure of the New York underworld in his favor. The most dangerous weapon in a war is not a gun or a knife or a bomb. It's control. Control of the narrative. Control of the message. Vito Genovese understood this better than anyone. He knew that what people believed was more powerful than what they saw. By turning Sal Moretti's death into a gruesome piece of theater, he ensured that everyone understood the core lesson. The house always wins. Not because it's lucky, but because it sets the rules. And it will burn down the whole casino to punish anyone who tries to cheat. Years later, long after he had become the undisputed boss of all bosses, a journalist managed to ask a then-aging Genovese about the rumors from his past, about the bodies and the betrayals. Vito, old and frail, but with the same penetrating eyes, offered a rare, thin smile. He didn't confirm or deny anything. He simply said, "In my life, I always paid my debts, and I always made sure others paid theirs." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of 100 steel drums resting at the bottom of the Hudson River. It was the final, concluding line of a story written in blood and fear, a story that proved that in Vito Genovese's New York, respect wasn't just given. It was brutally and unforgettably earned. The story of Sal Moretti is a brutal reminder of the cold logic that governed that world. Was this justice, or was this revenge? Could Vito have handled it differently and maintained his power? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I read all of them. And hey, turn those notifications on, because the story of Vito Genovese is far from over. If you think a barrel was extreme, wait until you hear what he did to a man who betrayed him at the Appalachian meeting. The story we're telling next week is even crazier. You won't want to miss it. In the end, Vito's code was simple, and it was absolute. It was a philosophy that kept him on top for decades. The Bronx protects its own. But Genovese's New York, it buried its mistakes.